Good morning. So it's been an interesting summer, hasn't it? I've sat out there all summer where all of you are now, and I've been in and out of town, but a couple of things have struck me. The first thing is this. Almost every single person who has had the privilege of being part of this summer sermon series has expressed some level of anxiety over being part of something called the Summer of Good Preaching. The second thing that has struck me is that although Matt asked us to choose our favorite Bible story or passage and preach on it, almost every single person, at least when I've been in town, has had a reason to explain why they couldn't do that. Either they thought the story that they love was too common and somebody else would pick it, or they weren't called to preach on that one, or Mandy Sayers said a couple of weeks ago, hey, my favorite is whatever one I'm reading at the time. So, I am no exception to either one of those two things. I am anxious, and I am not preaching on my favorite Bible story or passage. I am also not preaching on a sermon title that I've been holding on, waiting to use for 14 years called, Yes, My Kids Ate the Communion. Austin told me yesterday that using that picture is unforgivable, so we'll see if he ever comes back from college. Nor am I going to preach on the companion, and that sermon is based on real life events, nor am I going to preach on the companion sermon title, also I'm embarrassed to admit, based on real life events called My Dog Ate the Communion. But if I'm not going to preach on any of the enthralling members of my extended family ate the communion sermons, what am I going to talk about? Well, back at the very beginning of the summer, Andy Lunt shared with us how our purpose from God is to be love letters to the world. And I was fascinated because I had pretty much all of this down. I didn't listen to that sermon until like 3 days ago because I was out of town that week and I haven't been where I've had a lot of internet access. And I listened to it a couple of days ago and I went, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to be a love letter from God to the world. And we've had a lot of big ideas this summer. Mandy preached on fountains of living water, and Jen Eshelman talked about being downwardly mobile. And there are all these great big ideas about how God wants us to be in the world. And I want to be those things, but they're hard. So then Kathy Lehmanstahl, about, a month or so ago, preached on how we see the world as impacted by our faith, right? Do we see the world through eyes of fear or eyes of faith? When the Israelite soldiers looked at Goliath, they went, oh man, he's so big, we'll never kill him. But David looked at Goliath with eyes of faith and thought, he's so big, I can't miss, right? I want to be the person who looks at these big ideas with eyes of faith and goes out and lives them. And particularly what's been in my heart lately is loving my neighbor. So, unfortunately for me, sometimes it seems too hard and my faith is too small. So that's where I got. I want to share with you today a few specifics, a few ideas that have come into my life. The how-tos, the instruction manual, yes, my friends, loving your neighbor for dummies. Now, there's a children's book that I have loved for many, many years. It's called Old Turtle. And it's written by Douglas Wood and illustrated by Ching-Ki Chi. And in the book, the author, Douglas Wood, talks about how long, long ago, all of God's creations could speak to and understand one another. And not surprisingly, all of them knew God in a way that was familiar to themselves. So, for example, the breeze knew God as a wind that was never still. And the antelope knew God as a runner, swift and free, who loved to leap and race with the wind. And also, not surprisingly, all of the trees and the rocks and the animals began to argue about whose idea of God was correct, until Old Turtle asked them to stop. She told them that none of their single understandings of God was correct, that God was all of those things and more. And then Old Turtle tells them this. There will soon be a new family of beings in the world, she said, and they will be strange and wonderful. They will be reminders of all that God is. They will come in many colors and shapes, with different faces and different ways of speaking. Their thoughts will soar to the stars, and their feet will walk the earth. They will possess many powers. They will be strong, yet tender, a message of love from God to the earth, and a prayer from the earth back to God. And the people came. But the people forgot. They forgot they were a message of love and a prayer from the earth, and they began to argue about who knew God and who did not, and where God was and was not, and whether God was or was not. And often the people misused their powers and hurt one another or killed one another, and they hurt the earth because the people could not remember who they were or where God was. For the past few years, I've been having a really hard time with people. I don't know about you, but it seems to me when I was growing up, like we could disagree with one another and still get along. We could feel differently about things and still value one another as people, but everybody seems so angry now. Everybody seems defensive. It happens everywhere. It happens within homes. It happens in neighborhoods. It happens in schools and workplaces. It happens in churches. It happens, does it happen in domestic politics, right? It happens between countries and tribes and races. It happens everywhere, and it seems to me that everywhere I look, people are getting angrier and angrier and angrier. They're getting less flexible and more intolerant. They're getting less loving, or they seem less loving and more hateful. So where I ended up today, or perhaps where God dragged me, is to wanting to share with you, to confess to you how impossible it seems to me sometimes to love my neighbor. It's a common topic. It's one people preach on it all the time. It's all through the Bible. We're supposed to love our neighbors. But I need to preach on this because it's getting harder and harder. I've had some experiences lately that have convicted my heart and have started, and I am using the word started, right, because I am so a work in progress, but have started to shape the way that I understand and I'm trying to live this concept of loving my neighbor. The other reason it seemed like a good idea is, as Jen mentioned, tomorrow is the first day of school. I always want to go da-da-da-dum when I say that. Tomorrow is the first day of school, and while a lot of people make New Year's resolutions in January, those of us who are tied this intimately to the academic calendar, well, we tend to make our resolutions right here and now at the beginning of the school year. So it seems like a really, really good time to focus on this one piece of living God's love in a hurting world and to share with you how it's changing my life. I think it's easy to love some people, right? I mean, people who have health challenges, it seems really, I don't have a hard time sharing God's love. You can deliver a meal, drive someone to an appointment, pray for them, send a card. Or perhaps people who have financial challenges, you go on a mission trip and you help repair a home, or donate food, or you might help with Wish Upon a Star at holiday times. Those, to me, are easy ways of sharing God's love. But we're surrounded with people everywhere we look by people who are hurting emotionally, people who don't know God's love or maybe don't access it in their daily lives. And the pain that those people feel comes out in all kinds of really nasty ways. And they're hard to love. I found this New York Times article entitled, "Help, I'm Surrounded by Jerks." And I was really excited when I found it because that was my working title, but I didn't want to put it in the bulletin because I thought somebody might be offended. But anyway, so help, I'm surrounded by jerks. And it spoke to me, right? Because my life would be great if there just weren't so many difficult people everywhere I go. By the way, as an aside, I am fully aware of the fact that I can be one of those difficult people and that I need to work on that too, but I only get like 20-something minutes and that's a whole nother sermon. Anyway, in the article, Stephanie Rosenblum says this: "Certain mortals have the power to sink hearts and sour moods with lightning speed. The hysterical colleague, the meddlesome neighbor, the crazy in-law, the explosive boss. A melange of cantankerous individuals, they are united by a single achievement. They make life miserable." You know these people, right? You run into them in the store or the parking lot. You sit next to them at school or work. You serve with them on the PTA or, yes, perhaps even at church. You see them on the internet or the TV. They aren't content with just disagreeing with you. They have to cut you down to size. Sometimes it takes the form of really vicious personal attacks. Sometimes, they creep around in the environment and talk about you to everybody else except to you. Sometimes they're just in a meeting, they're on TV, and they're in this vicious, hate-filled rant, and they just won't stop talking. And every day it feels like, to me, I see more and more of these people in the world. So I have a choice. I can write them off and remove myself from the toxic environment, which I want to say there are times when you do need to remove yourself from a toxic relationship, but I can remove myself from the toxic environment, except I'm not sure these days where I would go that I could get away from all of that. But that's not what I do. So those of you who know me really well might know that I have a bit of a flair for the dramatic. I love emotions. It might be why I'm such a rabid sports fan, right? Because there is no more rapid high or low that comes when your favorite team wins a really big trophy, or when that low that you, oh, how'd they get up there? Your favorite team wins the FA Cup in double overtime last spring, or when they lose that heartbreaking game. I cry at commercials all the time. I weep in worship regularly. You've all seen it. And a really great anthem can strengthen my resolve, or, as it did this morning, send tears pouring down my face. I love the emotional highs and lows. And there is nothing, if I'm really being honest with myself, that gives you a good old emotional go-around like that feeling that you get of self-righteous indignation, right? You know what I'm talking about. They're wrong, and you're right, and you just can't wait to tell everybody about it. Except there is nothing that any of those feelings of anger or indignation or self-righteousness do to help me love my neighbor. And none of them makes me feel one bit better in the long run. More dangerously, they lead me to places that I don't want to go. When I'm feeling all of these negative emotions, I am led to gossip. I triangulate. I do that thing, where I'm upset with you, but I'm going to go tell everybody else instead of talking to you. I'm judgmental. I'm not kind. I have no peace. And I have no way to reflect God's love to a hurting person in a hurting world. So what I had to start figuring out was this. In a society where we feel like at times we're getting further and further and further apart every day, I had to figure out the how-to of loving some of my neighbors, or loving your neighbor for dummies. It's a very simple concept. Reference today's scripture, the piece that really spoke to me is, do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay it with a blessing. It's really simple, but I'm too stubborn to get the simplicity of it. So I've been really lucky. I have had, over the course of my experience as part of this faith community, some things come my way. Some through social media from other members of this faith community, some through sermons, some through Bible studies that have helped me begin to write this book, my version of how I'm supposed to try and be this love letter to the world that we heard about. So I'm sharing them with you. Chapter 1, where did that come from? We're actually a slide behind. Go ahead and grab that next one. Chapter 1, where did that come from? This is actually the shortest chapter so far, but it is one that has impacted me deeply, and this one came to me through Facebook, through a member of Glen Mar. It's a quote. Most of you have probably seen some version of it, but it really speaks to me. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. Speaks for itself, right? That angry man in the parking lot might have just lost his job. The rude bank teller might have a child who's fighting addiction. I'm not even going to talk about the people in the Motor Vehicle Administration. Suffice it to say, if you hold it in your mind that there might be a backstory that you don't know, it makes it a whole lot easier to respond positively. Chapter 2, just drop it. This one also came from a quote. I got this one from another Andy Lunt sermon, but a really, really long time ago, and I wrote it right in my Bible. Again, a lot of different versions of it on the internet, and it's attributed to a lot of different people, but the basic concept is this. Holding on to hate or anger is like taking the poison yourself and waiting for the other person to die. Right? We see versions of it in the Bible too. In 1 John, whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. We hold on to that negative stuff and carry it around, and it does nothing but weigh us down. There's a great story in Dr. Anthony Evans' book, Guiding Your Family in a Misguided World, and it's about two monks. And the monks were walking from one village to another, and they were going to help with the harvest. And they come to a river, and there's an elderly woman sitting by the river, and she can't get across because there's no bridge. So the first monk asks the woman, "Can we help you cross the river?" And she accepts. So they make a seat with their hands, and they carry her across the river. And then they set her down, and she goes about her way, and they go on about theirs. And they get about a mile down the road, and the second monk says to the first monk, "Look at me. I am absolutely filthy. Look at my clothes. They're wrecked from carrying that old woman across the river. And my back is still hurting. I can feel it getting stiff." And the first monk just smiles and nods. They go a few more miles, and then the second monk starts again to griping, "My back is hurting me so badly, and all because we had to carry that silly old woman across the river. I cannot go any further because of the pain." And the first monk looks down at his companion, who at this point is laying on the ground moaning, and he says to him, "Have you wondered why I'm not complaining? Your back hurts because you are still carrying the woman, but I set her down 5 miles ago." It's what we do, right? We take that anger and we hold on to it. We're like that second monk who can't let go. We carry it around with us everywhere, and it weighs us down. It keeps us from forgiving. It keeps us from understanding, from living God's love in a tough situation. I want to tell you that I access that quote at least 3 or 4 times a week, either out loud or in my mind, every week of my life. Chapter 3, it's all in your point of view. This one's about perspective. I love the idea of perspective. I'm not an artist, but one of the things that I find so fascinating about perspective is if I'm standing here looking at you and you're looking back at me, we have completely opposite perspectives. But I want to talk about an athlete. Again, I love athletics and athletes, and I was fascinated by this ice dancers, the American ice dancers, Meryl Davis and Charlie White during the Olympics. They won the gold medal, the first for the U.S. in ice dancing. And they have a great story. I encourage you to look into it. They seem to have been raised in a really cutthroat and competitive world by parents who taught them all the right things. After the Olympics was over, Meryl and Charlie were on the television show Dancing with the Stars. Now, I don't usually watch this show, but I love Meryl and Charlie, so I did. And if you don't know the show, non-dancers are paired with dancers, and they learn a dance, and they perform it on the show, and they get judged, and they get people call in and vote for them, and at the end of the whole, 18 weeks, there's a winner. So about the middle of the show, Charlie had a bad night. The judges were mean, his votes were low, he was in danger of being cut. And they interviewed him, and the interviewer says to Charlie, they do like a video package before they show their dance of everything they've gone through during the week to learn it. And he says, "Do you know your video was only 1 minute and 6 seconds long? And so had 2 minutes and 59 seconds. How do you feel about that?" And Charlie's partner said, "Well, we weren't really aware of that. We don't really watch all those packages, but if that's true, it's not fair. Right? Charlie should get just as much exposure. He's working just as hard as everybody else, and everybody needs to see what he's going through." And Charlie cut her off, 26 years old. And he said, "Actually, what makes good TV is things like what they want to see and show is like people getting injured and working through it, and people fighting with their partners and having relationship problems." He goes, "I'm actually really grateful. I'm having a really good time. I'm grateful mine was only 1 minute because that means none of that stuff's happening to me." I want to be Charlie White when I grow up. I really do. I was fascinated by that. It's about perspective. Do I look at the coworker who lied and threw me under the bus because they couldn't do their own job or made a mistake with anger and defensiveness? Or am I so relieved that I don't have to live my life that way, that I don't feel that fear and anxiety that leads me to have to do those things? I'm not suggesting for a minute that if you have that situation with a coworker, you don't have to address it, but I am saying that if you come at it with those feelings of like relief and the positive feelings, maybe you'll get a better resolution in the end than you would if you came back with like for like. In chapter 4, and this is really the one that got me here in the first place, the one that's been like in my head and in my heart in a way I can't get rid of it all spring, is called The Big Picture. This is also my public service announcement for Bible study. I love Bible study. I've been doing Bible study pretty much for the last 16 years with a couple of breaks. And what I love about Bible study is that you can read the same passage over and over and over again. And what's happening in your life shapes the way that God speaks to you through the passage. You can read it completely differently. The Bible's like this living, breathing communication that speaks into your life. And folks, I have a life that needs speaking into really regularly. Anyway, so sign up for Bible study. But besides that, so last spring I'm sitting in my Wednesday night Bible study, and it is here at Glen Mar, and it's a bunch of great people who are fond of saying things like, "Well, just for argument's sake," or "What if we read it this way?" But we were reading Psalm 51. I don't remember what the lesson was about, and I didn't even go back and look it up because that is not what God spoke to me that night. Reading Psalm 51, if you don't know Psalm 51, you remember King David, and he did some good stuff and some not so good stuff, but at one particular part in his life, he was kind of really a bad boy. He looked out and he saw this beautiful woman, Bathsheba, and he wanted her. So he got her. And the result of their coming together was that she became pregnant. Did I mention that she was married to Uriah? So David did a couple of things. One is he tried to get Uriah to come home and be with his wife so he wouldn't get in trouble, but that didn't work out for a couple of reasons. And then, since he couldn't resolve it any other way, David sent out orders that Uriah, who was a soldier, be put on the front lines of the battlefield where he would be killed, and he was, thereby clearing the way for David to have Bathsheba for himself. So they sent Nathan to him, and this Psalm 51, is part of David's sort of confession after all of these things happened. David says this, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." Against you, God, you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. That verse that night struck me like a bolt of lightning. It might be a really simple concept. You all might have it already. I had never thought of it this way. In 1 John, sin is defined as breaking God's law. In Deuteronomy, it's defined as disobedience or rebellion against God. Sin is not against me. Sin is against God. And we all know from our own experiences that sin separates us from God. When someone wrongs me, one of these difficult people, I might be collateral damage. But the big problem is their relationship with God, just like it is when I sin. And if I look at it that way, it really changed how I was able to respond to them, because I'm part of this faith community where we are supposed to be rooting people in the life-giving message of God and Jesus Christ. And if I respond to them like for like, well, I'm not only not helping to bring them any closer to God, I'm not bringing myself any closer to God either. Simple concept, one I had never thought of before. It began for me a process that is very, very early, but it began to change for me, hopefully forever, the way that I look at loving my neighbor and the way that I live my life. There was a really great risk for me in sharing this message with you today, because now you know what one of my big struggles is, if you didn't know it already from knowing me. And now you can hold me accountable. So I have to try harder, and I have to be more consistent. But I had to do it because I need to live this. It's supposed to be really, really simple. Like the people in the story of Old Turtle, we're supposed to be able to remember that we are meant to be a message of love from God. And we're given great blessings in order to be able to share that love with one another. But if you're as confused and sometimes weak as I am, sometimes you need that little how-to, the little help, a little reminder of the message of Old Turtle in the book. Because in the words of Old Turtle, who reminds God's creations that God is indeed everywhere and everything, after a long, lonesome, and scary time, the people listened, and the people began to hear and to see God in one another and in the beauty of all the earth. Old Turtle smiled, and so did God. It's really all we're asked to do, isn't it? We're supposed to see God in one another. Sometimes it's harder than others. But if we try, if we really, really try, we can do it, and maybe we even let other people see God in us. And sometimes it will change them right away in a way that we can see and experience, and sometimes it won't. But when you throw the rock into the pond, you don't always get to see where the ripples hit the shore. It might not happen ever where we can see it. But I have to tell you from my own experience, there is so much peace and joy from trying. It lifts you up instead of dragging you down. And if you're really, really lucky, God will use you to lift someone else up too. Amen.